She told herself it was just a funeral, just a gathering of old acquaintances, people from a life she had carefully folded away. But the moment she saw his name on the guest list, something inside her chest tightened in a way that felt both foreign and achingly familiar. Daniel would be there. After 17 years of calculated distance, of different cities and deliberate choices, they would be in the same room again, and Eleanor knew with a certainty that made her hands tremble as she held the printed card that some doors never fully close, they just wait, slightly ajar, for the right moment to swing open again. The house stood exactly as she remembered it, Margaret's countryside estate, with its stone walls softened by decades of climbing roses, the gravel driveway that crunched under careful footsteps, the oak tree in the front garden, where summer evenings used to dissolve into long conversations and wine that tasted better than it probably was. Margaret had been Daniel's aunt, but she had loved Elena too. Perhaps had loved what Elena and Daniel almost were, that fragile thing they never quite named. Now Margaret was gone, and the house was full of people who had known her, people who were performing the careful dance of grief and polite memory. Elena arrived early, deliberately. She needed to see the space before she saw him, needed to remember how to breathe in rooms that held too much history. The living room was exactly the same worn Persian rug, the same landscape paintings, the same afternoon light falling through the western windows. She stood there alone for a moment, and it was almost possible to believe she was 31 again instead of 48. Almost possible to pretend that the version of herself who used to curl up on that sofa with a book still existed somewhere beneath the years, and the choices and the careful construction of a life that made sense. You came early too. His voice came from the doorway, quiet and unsurprised, as if 17 years had been 17 minutes. Eleanor turned slowly, giving herself time to arrange her face into something neutral, something that wouldn't betray the fact that her heart was doing something erratic and entirely inappropriate for a woman her age at a funeral gathering. Daniel looked older, of course. His hair was grey at the temples. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before, but he was unmistakably himself, the same careful posture, the same way of standing as if he was always slightly apologetic for taking up space. "I wanted to see it again," Elena said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected. "Before everyone else arrived." She didn't say "before you arrived," but they both heard it anyway. Daniel nodded, stepping into the room but maintaining distance, as if there were invisible boundaries neither of them wanted to cross. "She talked about you," he said. "Margaret, even at the end. She used to say you were the one who got away, and I never corrected her because it wasn't exactly wrong." The words hung between them, too honest for the circumstances, too raw for people who had spent nearly 2 decades practicing absence. Elena looked away, focusing on the painting above the fireplace, a seascape, all grey water and white sky. "We were never actually together," she said, and it was something she had told herself so many times it should have felt true. "Not really." Daniel made a sound that might have been agreement or contradiction. "No," he said quietly, "we were just everything except that." And there it was, the truth they had both avoided naming back then, now spoken aloud in Margaret's living room while the afternoon light shifted and footsteps sounded on the gravel outside. Other guests were arriving. Soon the room would fill with conversation and shared anecdotes and the structured performance of communal mourning. But for this moment, they were alone with the thing they had never been, and somehow still were. The evening unfolded the way these gatherings always do. People clustered in small groups, speaking in hushed tones that gradually grew more animated, as wine was poured and memories were shared. Elena found herself standing near the window, watching Daniel from across the room. He was talking to Margaret's neighbours, his hands moving slightly as he spoke, the same gesture he used to make when he was explaining something he cared about. She had forgotten that detail, or thought she had, but apparently her body remembered things her mind had tried to archive. "You two are being very civilized." The voice belonged to Patricia, Margaret's oldest friend, a woman in her 70s with sharp eyes and no patience for pretense. She had appeared at Elena's elbow with 2 glasses of wine, offering one with a look that suggested refusal wasn't an option. "Thank you," Elena said, accepting the glass. "We're adults. It's been a long time. Patricia made a sound of polite disbelief. Time doesn't change what mattered, she said, her tone matter of fact. Margaret used to say you two were the saddest thing she'd ever seen. All that feeling and neither of you brave enough to reach for it. Elena felt something tighten in her throat. It was more complicated than that, she said, but Patricia was already shaking her head. It's always more complicated, the older woman said. That's what people tell themselves when they're afraid. But fear doesn't make you wiser, dear. It just makes you lonelier. She patted Elena's arm with surprising gentleness and moved away, leaving Elena with her wine and the uncomfortable truth that she had spent 17 years becoming exactly the kind of lonely Patricia had described. Successful, certainly. She had built a career, cultivated friendships, traveled to places she had once only read about. But there was a particular kind of emptiness that came from knowing you had walked away from something real, because real had felt too dangerous, too uncertain, too likely to hurt. Across the room, Daniel glanced up, and their eyes met for just a moment before both looked away. It was the same choreography they had perfected all those years ago, the art of seeing each other without quite looking, of being aware without acknowledging, of wanting without reaching. They had been so good at it then, and apparently the skill hadn't faded. Eleanor excused herself and walked out to the garden, needing air, needing distance from the weight of all those careful glances and unspoken words. The garden was cooler now, the sun setting behind the old stone wall. Eleanor stood near the oak tree, the one where they used to sit during those summer visits, when everything had felt suspended in possibility. She could remember specific conversations they'd had here, not the words exactly, but the feeling of them. The way Daniel had looked at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention, the way she had looked back when she knew he was. They had circled each other for 3 entire summers, coming close but never quite closing the distance, always finding reasons why the timing wasn't right, why it was complicated, why they should wait. And then she had met Richard. Kind, straightforward Richard, who had asked her to dinner without hesitation, who had said he loved her after 6 months and meant it simply, without layers of uncertainty. She had said yes to Richard, because yes had felt safe and possible and free from the terrifying weight of everything she felt when she looked at Daniel. And Daniel, when she told him, had smiled and said he was happy for her, and neither of them had acknowledged that his smile didn't quite reach his eyes, or that her voice had wavered when she said Richard's name. "I knew you'd be out here." Daniel's voice came from behind her, gentle and resigned. Elena didn't turn around. "I needed some air," she said. "It's a lot, being back." She heard him move closer, but he didn't touch her, didn't invade the careful space she was trying to maintain. "I thought about calling you," he said after a moment. "Over the years, probably 100 times. But it never seemed right. You were married. You had a life, and what would I even say?" Elena closed her eyes, feeling the familiar ache of roads not taken. "I got divorced," she said quietly. 4 years ago. It was amicable. We just—" She paused, searching for words that wouldn't be too revealing. "We just weren't quite right for each other." She could feel Daniel absorbing this information, the weight of what she wasn't saying. "I'm sorry," he said, and she knew he meant it. Knew also that there was another feeling beneath the sorry, something they still couldn't name. "What about you?" she asked, still not turning around. "Did you ever—" She let the question trail off, not quite brave enough to finish it. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. "There were people," he said finally. "A few relationships. One lasted almost 5 years, but I could never quite—" He stopped, and Eleanor heard him take a breath. "I could never quite stop measuring everyone against something that never actually happened." The words settled between them, honest and terrible and relieving all at once. Elena finally turned to face him, and in the fading light his expression was unguarded in a way she rarely remembered seeing. "We were cowards," she said, "and it wasn't an accusation, just an observation." "We were young," Daniel replied, "and scared of getting it wrong." "So we chose nothing instead," Elena said, which turned out to be its own kind of wrong. They stood there in Margaret's garden as the evening deepened around them, Two people who had spent 17 years trying to convince themselves that almost was enough, that the ghost of something was better than the risk of its reality. Inside, people were beginning to leave. They could hear car doors closing, voices calling goodbyes, the sound of gravel under tires. Soon they would have to go back inside, would have to return to being polite acquaintances who shared a history but had chosen separate futures. But for this moment, they were just Daniel and Elena in a garden they both remembered, surrounded by the weight of everything they had never said. "I kept one of your letters," Daniel said suddenly. "The one you sent from Paris, the summer before you met Richard. You wrote about this cafe where you had breakfast every morning and how the light came through the window and made everything look like a painting. I don't know why I kept it. I kept telling myself I'd throw it away, that I was being ridiculous, but—" He stopped, shaking his head. "I still have it, in my desk drawer. I've moved 4 times and it's always come with me." Elena felt something crack open inside her chest. "I have a photograph," she admitted, "from Margaret's birthday party the last summer we were both here. Someone took it without us noticing. We're sitting on the porch steps and you're saying something that made me laugh and I'm looking at you like—" She paused, steadying her voice. "Like you were the only person in the world. I've looked at that photo probably 1,000 times. I should have thrown it away years ago, but I couldn't. I kept thinking maybe one day it would stop hurting to look at it, but it never did. It just hurt differently." Daniel moved closer then, close enough that she could see the exact color of his eyes in the dimming light, close enough to remember how many times she had imagined closing this distance and never had the courage to actually do it. "Do you ever wonder," he said quietly, "what would have happened if one of us had been braver? If we'd actually tried instead of just—" "Every day," Elena interrupted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I wonder every single day." And there it was, the truth they had both been carrying, the weight of all those unmade choices and unuttered words. They were 17 years older now, old enough to know that life rarely offered second chances, that timing was a luxury and courage was often learned too late. "We could have dinner," Daniel said, and the words came out uncertain, tentative, as if he was testing whether the possibility still existed. "Before you go back to wherever you're living now, just dinner, as people who used to know each other and maybe want to know each other again." Elena looked at him, at this man who had somehow remained the measuring stick against which she had judged every other connection, every other possibility. It would be easy to say no, to protect herself, to maintain the careful distance they had perfected. It would be safe to leave things as they were, to carry the might-have-been back to her carefully constructed life and let it remain a beautiful, painful abstraction. But standing in Margaret's garden, surrounded by roses that had outlived the woman who planted them, Eleanor felt tired of safety, tired of protection, and tired of choosing the path that hurt less in the moment and more over the course of years. "I'm staying at the inn in the village," she said, "the one near the church. I'm here until Sunday." It wasn't yes, and it wasn't no, just information, just an opening. Daniel nodded slowly, and something in his expression shifted, became a little less guarded. "I'm staying there too," he said. "Small world. Small village," Elena corrected, and despite everything she almost smiled. Margaret would have arranged it this way if she could have. They walked back toward the house together, not touching, but close enough that their shoulders almost brushed, close enough to remember how it used to feel to exist in each other's orbit. The gathering was ending. People were collecting coats and saying final goodbyes, and Margaret's house was settling back into silence. Elena found Patricia near the door and thanked her for the wine and the conversation. The older woman looked between Elena and Daniel with knowing eyes and said simply, "Don't waste any more time, dears. You're not getting younger and life is shorter than you think." Then she kissed them both on the cheek and left before either could respond. By the time they locked up the house, Daniel had keys. He was helping with the estate. It was fully dark. The inn was only a 10-minute walk down the village road, and they fell into step together naturally, as if they had been walking side by side all along instead of maintaining careful distance across years and miles. Neither spoke for a while. They just walked, listening to the sound of their footsteps and the rustling of leaves, and the distant sound of the church bell marking the hour. "Do you remember what you said to me?" Elena asked suddenly, breaking the silence. "The night before I left for Paris?" Daniel was quiet for a moment, but she could tell he knew exactly which night she meant. "I said I'd miss you," he said finally, "and you said you'd write, and I said that wasn't what I meant." Elena nodded, the memory sharp and clear. "And I asked what you did mean, and you—" "I didn't answer," Daniel finished. "I changed the subject. I was too afraid of what would happen if I actually told you the truth." They had reached the inn now, a small stone building with warm lights glowing in the windows. They stopped at the entrance, neither quite ready to go inside and end this tentative reconnection. "What was the truth?" Elena asked, even though she thought she knew, even though she had carried her guess like a secret for all these years. Daniel looked at her directly then, with none of the careful avoidance they had practiced so well. "That I was already in love with you," he said, "that I had been for months, that the thought of you leaving felt like losing something I never actually had the courage to claim, that I was terrified and furious at myself, and completely frozen by the certainty that if I said it out loud, I'd ruin everything." His voice was steady, but there was something raw beneath it, something that had clearly been waiting a long time to be spoken. Elena felt tears prick at her eyes and forced them back. "I knew," she said quietly. "Or I thought I did. But I was waiting for you to say it first because I was just as scared. And then you didn't say it, and I convinced myself I'd been wrong, that I'd imagined it, that what I felt was bigger than what you felt. So when Richard came along and made everything simple and clear, I thought maybe that was better. Maybe uncertainty meant it wasn't real." She paused, steadying her voice. "I was so stupid. I traded something extraordinary for something safe, and I told myself it was the mature choice." Daniel reached out then, his hand hovering near hers but not quite touching, as if he was still asking permission after all these years. "We were both stupid," he said. "We both chose fear. But we're not those people anymore, Elena. We're older, and we've made our mistakes, and maybe—" He stopped, seeming to struggle with what came next. "Maybe we get to make a different choice now. Maybe it's not too late for something we should have done 17 years ago." Elena looked down at his hand, so close to hers, and thought about all the times she had imagined this, all the versions of reaching out that had existed only in her mind. She thought about Margaret, who had loved them both and seen what they couldn't let themselves see. She thought about Patricia's words about time and fear and loneliness, and then finally she closed the distance. Her fingers found his and held on, and it was such a simple gesture, but it felt monumental, like crossing a border she had been standing at for nearly 2 decades. Daniel's hand tightened around hers, his thumb moving gently across her knuckles, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing that needed to be said. They were standing outside a village inn on a cool evening in late September, and they were no longer young, and they had wasted so much time, but they were here and they were holding hands, and maybe that was enough to start with. "Dinner tomorrow?" Daniel asked. And this time it wasn't a tentative suggestion, but a real question with weight behind it. "Yes," Elena said, and the word came out clear and certain. "Tomorrow." They stood there for another moment, neither quite ready to let go and walk inside to their separate rooms. But eventually they did, because that's what people do. They take small steps. They move forward into uncertainty. They choose the risk of something real over the safety of nothing at all. Eleanor lay awake that night in her small inn room, listening to the sounds of the village settling into sleep. She thought about all the years she had spent constructing a life that looked right from the outside but had always felt slightly off-center, like a picture frame hung just a degree too crooked. She thought about the conversations she'd had with friends, where she'd said she was happy, and how that had been both true and not true at the same time. She thought about the night she'd finally admitted to Richard that she had married him for the wrong reasons, that she had loved him but not in the way he deserved, and how he had been sad but not surprised, as if he had always known there was something else, someone else taking up space she couldn't quite give him. She thought about Daniel keeping her letter all these years, about the photograph she still carried in her wallet, despite telling herself it was foolish. She thought about how easy it would be to fall back into old patterns, to let fear win again, to treat this reconnection as a nostalgic interlude rather than a genuine second chance. And she thought about Patricia's words, about time and waste, and the particular regret that comes from choosing safety over truth. In the morning, sunlight streamed through the inn's lace curtains, and Elena woke with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. She dressed carefully, not out of vanity, but out of respect for the moment, for what she hoped might unfold. Downstairs in the small breakfast room, Daniel was already there, sitting at a corner table with coffee and a newspaper. He clearly wasn't reading. He looked up when she entered, and his expression shifted into something that was almost shy, as if he was just as uncertain about how to navigate this new territory as she was. "Good morning," Elena said, sliding into the chair across from him. "Good morning," he replied, and there was a weight to those ordinary words, an acknowledgement of everything that had shifted between them the night before. They ordered breakfast and talked carefully around the important things at first, discussing the funeral arrangements and Margaret's estate and the pleasant neutrality of the village. But gradually the conversation deepened, became more honest. Daniel told her about his work, about the architecture firm he'd started and then sold, about how he'd spent the last few years consulting and traveling and trying to figure out what he actually wanted, now that he had the luxury of choice. Elena told him about her own career, the publishing company she'd helped build, and then left when it became clear she was good at it but didn't love it anymore. She told him about the small bookshop she'd opened in the coastal town where she now lived, how it barely made money, but filled something in her that her successful corporate life never had. "It sounds like you're rebuilding," Daniel observed, and Elena nodded. "I think I am," she said. "I spent so long being the person I thought I was supposed to be that I forgot to check whether that person was actually me. Does that make sense?" Daniel reached across the table and took her hand, right there in the breakfast room with other guests nearby, and daylight removing any possibility of pretending this was just nostalgia, or a private moment no one else would witness. "It makes perfect sense," he said. "I've been doing the same thing, trying to figure out who I actually am when I'm not performing competence or stability or whatever it is we're all supposed to perform." They sat there holding hands across the breakfast table, two people in their late 40s who had finally learned that pretending was more exhausting than honesty, that the cost of safety was often authenticity, that they had wasted enough time already. They spent the day together, walking through the countryside, visiting places they remembered from those long-ago summers. There was the pub where they used to have lunch, still serving the same dubious chicken pie. There was the church with the ancient yew tree where Margaret used to volunteer, arranging flowers and organizing jumble sales. There was the footpath that led up to the ridge where you could see for miles, all rolling green hills and scattered sheep, and the kind of pastoral beauty that made you understand why people wrote poetry about England. They talked steadily, catching up on 17 years in a single day, filling in the gaps they had left when they chose distance. Elena learned that Daniel's mother had died 5 years ago, that he had a niece he was particularly close to, that he had spent 6 months in Japan learning traditional woodworking techniques for reasons he couldn't quite articulate. Daniel learned that Elena had published a novel under a pseudonym, that she sang in a community choir, that she had learned to sail and found it both terrifying and essential. They learned the small details and the large ones, the ways they had changed and the ways they had remained fundamentally themselves. But beneath all of that exchange of information was something else. A constant awareness of each other, a heightened attention to small gestures and expressions, the way their hands brushed when they walked, the way their eyes met and held. It felt like falling into something, or maybe like finally allowing themselves to fall after years of carefully maintaining balance. By the time they returned to the village, the sun was setting and they were both tired, but neither wanted the day to end. "Dinner," Daniel said, and it wasn't a question anymore. Just a statement of what came next. "Yes," Elena agreed, "definitely dinner." The inn's restaurant was small and dimly lit, filled with locals and a few tourists. They sat in a corner booth and ordered wine and fish that came from the coast and vegetables from the garden behind the kitchen. The food was simple and good, and neither of them paid much attention to it because they were too focused on the conversation, on the way it felt to finally be honest with each other after so many years of careful editing. "I need to tell you something," Elena said when their plates were cleared and they were lingering over coffee. And I need you to just listen, because if I stop to think about whether I should say it, I won't." Daniel nodded, his expression serious. Elena took a breath, steadying herself. "I spent 17 years telling myself that what we had wasn't real because we never acted on it. That it was just potential, just imagination, just the fantasy of what might have been. I built an entire narrative where I was the mature one who chose reality over daydreams. But standing in Margaret's garden yesterday, holding your hand last night, spending today with you, I realized I was lying to myself. What we had was real. It's been real this entire time. It didn't need to be acted on to exist, and I'm tired of pretending otherwise." She paused, watching his face for reaction. "I don't know what this is now," she continued. "I don't know if we can actually build something after all this time, or if we're just two people caught up in nostalgia and grief and the romance of might have been. But I know I want to try. I know I don't want to walk away from you again and spend another 17 years wondering what if. I know I'm tired of safe choices that leave me lonely. So that's it, that's what I needed to say." She stopped talking and waited, her heart doing something complicated in her chest. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, and Elena felt fear creep in, fear that she had misread this, that she had been brave at the wrong time, that she had finally spoken her truth only to discover it wasn't shared. But then Daniel reached across the table and took both her hands in his, holding them firmly. And when he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "I've loved you since I was 30 years old," he said. "I've loved you through your marriage and my relationships, and all the distance we put between us. I've loved you in the way you love something you're convinced you can't have, carefully, privately, like a secret I was keeping even from myself. And I've been furious at myself for it, furious for wasting so much time, for being such a coward when it mattered." He paused, his thumbs moving across her knuckles the way they had the night before. "So yes," he said. "Yes to trying. Yes to being brave this time. Yes to whatever this becomes. We're not 30 anymore, and we can't get back the time we lost, but we have whatever comes next, and I don't want to waste that too." Eleanor felt tears slide down her face and didn't try to stop them. They sat there in the corner booth of a village inn, holding hands across the table. Two people who had finally stopped running from what they'd always known. The next days unfolded with a kind of gentle inevitability. Elena changed her return ticket, staying in the village longer than planned. They spent their time walking and talking and slowly learning how to be together without the layers of fear and pretense that had always separated them. They kissed for the first time on the 4th day, standing by the oak tree in Margaret's garden, where they had circled each other all those summers ago. It was afternoon, and the light was golden, and when Daniel's lips met hers, it felt both entirely new and like something they had done 1,000 times. They kissed like people who knew the value of what they were holding, like people who understood that second chances were rare and precious and not to be taken lightly. But as the days passed, reality began to reassert itself. Elena had a life to return to, a bookshop that needed her, commitments she couldn't simply abandon. Daniel had projects waiting, responsibilities, a life he had built in a city 4 hours away from where Elena lived. They talked about it carefully, trying not to let panic overwhelm the tenderness they had cultivated. "We'll figure it out," Daniel said, but Elena could hear the uncertainty beneath his confidence. "People manage long distance," she replied. "People make it work." But they both knew it wasn't simple, that logistics and distance had a way of eroding even the strongest intentions. On Elena's last evening in the village, they had dinner at the inn again, sitting at the same corner booth. The conversation was quieter now, weighted by the awareness that they were running out of time. "I don't want this to turn into another version of what we did before," Elena said, voicing the fear they had both been avoiding. "Where we have good intentions, but let distance and difficulty wear us down until we're back to being people who used to know each other." Daniel set down his wine glass and looked at her directly. "Then we don't let that happen," he said. "We choose differently this time. We're adults, we can make actual plans instead of just hoping things work out." They spent the rest of the evening being practical, exchanging schedules, talking about when they could see each other next, discussing the possibility of one of them relocating eventually if things progressed. It should have felt unromantic, this careful negotiation of logistics, but instead it felt like hope. It felt like choosing each other deliberately, instead of just being swept along by emotion. When they walked back to their rooms that night, they stopped at Elena's door and kissed for a long time, memorizing each other, holding on to the reality of this, before distance turned it abstract again. 2 weeks, Daniel said. I'll come visit your bookshop in 2 weeks. I want to see this life you've built. Elena nodded, trying not to cry. 2 weeks, she agreed, and then maybe you'll show me your city. Yes, Daniel said, all of it, every corner. They kissed again, and then separated because staying would have made leaving impossible, and they were trying to be wise now, trying to make choices that would sustain rather than consume. Helena left the village the next morning early, before the sun was fully up. She didn't say goodbye to Daniel because they had done that the night before, and she didn't trust herself not to break down if she had to do it again. She drove away with the rising sun in her rearview mirror and thought about Margaret, about how the old woman had seen something in them that they couldn't see in themselves, about how sometimes it takes loss to understand what you still have the chance to choose. The 2 weeks passed slowly. Eleanor threw herself into the bookshop, reorganizing shelves and ordering new stock, and trying not to constantly check her phone for messages from Daniel. But they talked every day, long phone calls in the evening where they discussed their days and their plans, and slowly built the infrastructure of a relationship. It felt both fragile and solid, this thing they were constructing out of words and intention, and the memory of those days in the village. When Daniel arrived at the bookshop on a Friday afternoon, Eleanor was helping a customer find a particular mystery novel. She looked up at the sound of the door chime, and there he was, standing in her space, looking around with genuine interest and pleasure. Her heart did something complicated and wonderful, and when the customer left, she walked straight to him and kissed him in front of the romance section, not caring who might see. "Hi," she said when they finally broke apart. "Hi," he replied, smiling in a way that made him look younger, lighter. "Show me everything." She gave him a tour of the shop, introducing him to her assistant and explaining her organizational system and pointing out her favorite corners and displays. Daniel asked thoughtful questions and picked up books and seemed genuinely engaged. And Eleanor felt something settle in her chest, the recognition that this was working, that they were actually managing to bridge the gap between what they had been and what they might become. They had dinner at her favorite restaurant, a small place overlooking the harbor where you could watch fishing boats come in as the sun set. They talked easily, the conversation flowing the way it had in the village, punctuated by comfortable silences and shared laughter. "I like your life," Daniel said as they walked along the harbor afterward. "It suits you in a way I'm not sure your corporate life did, at least from what you've described." Elena leaned into him, grateful for the solid warmth of his presence. "I like your life too," she said, "from what I know of it so far. But I want to know more." "You will," Daniel promised. "Next visit, you come to me. I'll show you the studio where I work, introduce you to my friends, bore you with stories about architectural theory." "I won't be bored," Elena said, and she meant it. This was what she wanted. Not just the romance of reconnection, but the actual texture of a real life shared. The ordinary moments that built into something lasting. Daniel stayed for the weekend, and it was both wonderful and bittersweet. Wonderful to wake up next to him, to make breakfast together in her small flat above the shop, to spend Sunday morning reading in companionable silence. Bittersweet, because when he left on Sunday evening, the absence felt acute, a reminder of how much easier everything was when they were physically together. But they stuck to their plan, regular visits, constant communication, deliberate choice. Over the following months, they built a rhythm. Daniel came to her coastal town. Eleanor went to his city. They talked every evening, sharing the mundane details of their days, along with the deeper conversations. They met each other's friends, integrated into each other's lives, slowly stopped thinking of their worlds as separate. 6 months after Margaret's funeral, they had their first real fight. It was about something small, a misunderstanding about plans, hurt feelings that escalated, because distance made everything harder to navigate. They said things they didn't quite mean, hung up angry, spent a miserable evening each alone and furious. But the next morning, they called each other at the same time, both ready to apologize, both realizing that being right mattered less than being together. "We're going to fight sometimes," Elena said after they had worked through it. "We're not perfect, and this situation isn't easy." "I know," Daniel agreed. "But we're also going to figure it out. We're not walking away this time, remember?" And they didn't. They worked through the difficulties, learned each other's patterns and triggers, figured out how to be honest without being cruel and how to give space without withdrawing. A year after they reconnected, Daniel brought up the question of living arrangements. They were sitting in Elena's flat, having just finished dinner, and he said it casually, but she could tell it mattered. "I've been thinking, Mummy," he said, "about the logistics, about how we keep doing this long term." Elena set down her wine glass, her heart rate picking up. "I've been thinking about it too," she admitted. "I love my bookshop, but I'm not attached to this specific location. And your work could be done from anywhere with an airport nearby, couldn't it?" They looked at each other, both recognizing that they were approaching something significant. "We could find a place that works for both of us," Daniel said slowly. "Somewhere between your coast and my city. Or I could move here, or you could move there. I'm open to options as long as the option ends with us being in the same place." Elena felt tears prick at her eyes, the good kind, the kind that comes from relief and joy. "I want that," she said. "I want to wake up with you every day, not just the days we've scheduled weeks in advance. I want to build something real, something permanent. I want to stop feeling like we're constantly saying goodbye." Daniel reached for her hand, lacing their fingers together in a gesture that had become habitual, natural. "Then we'll do it," he said. "We'll figure out the details, make the necessary changes. We're good at complicated now, we'll handle it." And they did. It took months of planning and compromise and logistical negotiations, but they found a small house halfway between her coast and his city, a place with enough room for both of them to work, and a garden that reminded them both of Margaret's. Elena found someone to manage the bookshop, keeping ownership, but stepping back from day-to-day operations. Daniel restructured his consulting work to allow for more flexibility. They moved in together on a bright April morning, carrying boxes and arguing affectionately about where things should go, and marveling at the fact that they were actually doing this, actually choosing each other for real this time. The first night in their house, they sat on the floor of the empty living room with takeout containers and champagne, and Daniel raised his glass in a toast. "To Margaret," he said, "who loved us both and saw what we couldn't see, and to second chances, and to being brave enough to take them." "To all of that," Elena agreed, clinking her glass against his. They sat there in their new home, in a life they had built deliberately out of time and mistakes, and the courage to try again, and it felt right in a way nothing else ever had. It wasn't perfect. They still fought sometimes, still struggled with old patterns and fears that resurfaced without warning. But they were learning how to navigate those difficulties together, learning that love wasn't just feeling but choice, not just romance but partnership, not just possibility but actual sustained effort. Sometimes Elena would think about her younger self, the woman who had been too afraid to reach for what she wanted, who had chosen safety over truth. She felt tenderness toward that younger version, but also gratitude that she was no longer that person, that she had learned how to be braver, how to live with uncertainty, how to value connection over protection. And sometimes she would look at Daniel, cooking dinner or reading in his favorite chair or working at his desk, with that concentrated expression she loved, and feel overwhelmed by the simple fact of his presence, by the miracle of getting another chance at something she had thought was lost forever. They had wasted years, there was no denying that. They had chosen fear when they should have chosen each other, had let the perfect become the enemy of the possible. But they had also found their way back, had learned from their mistakes, had built something real out of the wreckage of what they almost had. And maybe that was enough. Maybe the story of second chances was always also the story of time lost and wisdom earned, and the particular kind of love that knows its own value because it knows what it cost to nearly lose it. Some stories don't have neat endings, don't resolve into fairy tale conclusions where everything is fixed and certain and complete. This was one of those stories. Elena and Daniel were together now, building a life, choosing each other daily. But they were also two people in their late 40s who had lived full, complicated lives before this moment, who carried histories and regrets and the knowledge that nothing is guaranteed. They didn't know how their story would end. They just knew they were tired of being apart, tired of what-ifs and almosts, tired of the particular loneliness that comes from walking away from something real. Years later, when they had weathered illness and loss and all the ordinary sorrows that come with time, Elena would think about that funeral gathering where it all began again. She would remember standing in Margaret's living room feeling like she was 31 again. Remember the moment Daniel's voice came from the doorway? Remember the weight of 17 years collapsing into a single afternoon? She would remember Patricia's words about fear and loneliness and time. And she would be grateful. Grateful that they had been given another chance. Grateful that they had been brave enough to take it. Grateful for every ordinary day they had built together out of the ruins of what they almost let slip away forever. Because in the end, that was the real story. Not the romance of reconnection, but the daily choice to stay, to work through difficulties, to keep reaching for each other even when it would be easier to retreat. They had never been a couple before, had spent years being almost and nearly and not quite. But they were a couple now, messy and real and imperfect, two people who had learned the hard way that some chances don't come again, that timing is often an excuse, that love is as much about courage as it is about feeling. And the pain that had known the way back, that had never quite faded despite distance and time, and determined attempts to move on, that pain had been transformed into something else. Not gone, because the loss of those years could never be fully erased, but integrated, acknowledged, accepted. It was part of their story now, part of what made their present connection so precious. They had earned each other, in a way. Had earned the right to build something lasting out of something that had once been only potential. If this story touched something you've carried silently, if you've ever walked away from someone because the timing felt wrong or the fear felt too large, know that your hesitation was human, your choices were understandable, your regret is shared. The comments below are a space for stories about roads not taken and second chances found, and the particular ache of recognizing too late what you had when you had it. What you share here matters. These stories of almost and finally remind us that it's never too late to be brave, that choosing safety over risk doesn't make you weak, just human. And that sometimes, if you're very lucky, you get another chance to choose differently.